guys, welcome to this new video. Today we are going to talk about Kubernetes control plane, and we are still in our series of Kubernetes for beginners. And today we are going to talk about Kubernetes control plane. Earlier in our other video, we mentioned that Kubernetes is actually made of two main components. We have the control plane, and then we have the worker node, also called cluster. So today we are going to focus on the control plane, and we are going to dip inside the control plane to see exactly what are the components of the control plane, or what the control plane, for example, is made of. So the first element that we are going to see on the control plane, for example, is called the scheduler. So in the control plane, we have one element that is called a scheduler, and the scheduler is responsible for assigning workload to the worker node based on resources, requirement, constraint, and other policy. It continuously monitor the cluster for newly created port, right? So that's the control plane. So that's the scheduler, right? Scheduler in general is just there to schedule, right? It's just there to schedule port actually inside the cluster, right? It's just there to schedule the port. I want to say by its name, scheduler. Let's dig more into the scheduler, right? So let's take a simple example in our day-to-day life, for example. So the scheduler is like a traffic manager in a busy city. So the scheduler is just like traffic manager in a busy city. It's just its job is to find the best place for each new workload, right? Just imagine that the scheduler is just like the traffic manager in the busy city, and his job is just there to find an easiest way, right? An easiest way to navigate the city, or an easiest way where you can go easily in the city without being stuck in, for example, in the traffic jam. So the second element is that picture the scheduler as a planner for a big event. For example, they decide where each guest should sit based on the factor like availability seat, who they should sit next to. So, what I was just trying to see here is that imagine that you have a big event, an event where you're going to have a lot of people, and you are going to have a master planner, right? Or an event planner, and the event planner is the one that's going to decide where guests are going to sit. So we may have like a VIP guests, first class guests, second class guests, third class guests. So the event planner will actually decide where those guys will sit. So that's just how the scheduler is. So the scheduler is just like somebody that look around and actually decide where the port need to be placed, right? When I say port here, a port is actually an element that contain a container and that lives inside the cluster. So the scheduler is just the element that actually go ahead and schedule port inside the cluster. So the second element that we are going to see in the control plane, the second element, the control plane, is going to be the controller manager, right? The controller manager. So the controller manager is responsible for managing various controllers that regulate the state of the cluster, right? This controller include replication controller, endpoint controller, service account token, controllers, and more, right? And each controller works to ensure that cluster reaches and maintain the desired state defined by the user. So that's the role of the controller manager. Now, let's break it down into something simple. So the controller manager is like a group of specialized worker in charge of different aspects of the cluster, right? So the controller manager is like a group of specialized worker in charge of different aspects of the cluster. Now, think of it as a team of workers in the factory. So let's take an example, a team of workers in the factory. So each worker has specific job, like ensuring there's enough product on the shelf or fixing any broken machinery. Similarly, controllers in Kubernetes have specific role, like ensuring there are enough replica of an app running and managing access and permissions. That's the role of the controller. So they are just there to make sure that things are right. So they are there to make sure that everything's okay. They are there to make sure that the number of replica set is actually set. The number of port that was actually desired by the user is actually running. They make sure that, for example, that if the user said, I want 10 replica set, for example, I want 10 replica on the port, so it will make sure that for that specific application, we are going to have 10 replica on the port. So that's a controller. So controller just like an administrator, somebody that actually oversee the cluster, somebody actually manage what's going on in the cluster. So look at the controller, for example, like the governor, right? The governor of Texas. So the governor of Texas actually oversee Texas. He makes sure that Texas workers are getting paid. He makes sure that Texas rules get constructed on time. It makes sure it regulate the cluster, right? It regulate rules in the state and everything. So it's just like a manager. Imagine that the manager of a store, right? Make sure that every single product is where it's supposed to be. That's what is called the controller manager. So another element that we are going to see is the etcd. So that's also one of the important elements. So the etcd is a distributed key value store that stores the cluster configuration data, state, and metadata. For example, it serves as the cluster's single source of truth and is used by Kubernetes to store all of its operational data, including the state of all objects on the system, right? Just imagine this like a database, right? That a database that the database that store everything or every important information about the cluster, for example. And we can take a simple example, right? Let's say etcd is like a library where Kubernetes store all its important information. Like in simple language, I like this definition more, like it's just like a library where Kubernetes actually store all its important information. So imagine etcd as a magical notebook where all the important detail about the cluster are written down. So whenever Kubernetes needs to know something, it check the notebook. This should be anything from what apps are running to how many resources are available and the cluster memory and everything. So etcd is just basically a place where all important information of the cluster are being stored. So far we have covered the etcd, we cover the scheduler, and we cover actually the controller manager, right? I would say the etcd just is the schedule. Sorry, we said the scheduler is just the element that actually schedule port into the cluster in simple language. We have the controller manager. The controller manager is actually the element that manage the cluster, it manage the state of the cluster and everything. And then we have the etcd. The etcd is actually a place where important element of the cluster gets stored, right? For example, when Kubernetes want to know something about the cluster, you actually read etcd to see exactly what's going on in the cluster, to see exactly everything that is being done in the cluster. Now we have one last element, which is actually the most important element. Is called the API, the API server, right? The API server is a central management entity in Kubernetes. It exposes the Kubernetes API, which allow user and external system to interact with the cluster. It process REST operation, validate them, and update the corresponding object in the etcd. So the API server, one of the most important element that we have in Kubernetes. So in a simple language, for example, think of the API server as the brain of Kubernetes. It's like the control center where you can communicate with the Kubernetes cluster. So even you as a human being, when you want to talk to the cluster, you go through the API server. So the API server is actually this central element that other element other element like the etcd, the controller manager, the scheduler to communicate with the cluster goes through the API server, right? And imagine also, like if we take something that our day-to-day life, imagine imagine it is a receptionist at the hotel. So it's just like the receptionist at the hotel. You tell the receptionist when you go to the hotel, for example, you tell the receptionist what you want, like booking a room, and they handle it for you. Similarly, you send requests to the API. Similarly with Kubernetes, you send your request to the API server, and the API server help you direct your request to the appropriate element, for example. So just generally speaking, we have 4 elements in the Kubernetes cluster. The first one is the scheduler, the Kubernetes control plane. The first one is actually the scheduler, which helps schedule port. The second element is the controller manager, which is actually the element that control the state of the cluster. Then we have the etcd, which is actually where all important element of the Kubernetes of the cluster of the Kubernetes environment is getting stored. Then we have the API server, which is like center control. For example, that's the element that help for communication. For example, whenever you want to ask something in a cluster, you send your request to the API server, and your API server redirect your request to the appropriate place. So that's all about the important element of the control plane. Those 4 elements: API server, control plane, scheduler, and etcd. I hope you like the video. See you on the next video. So I just want to recap here all the element that we mentioned. So we have the control plane, the first one, the API server, the second one, the scheduler, the third one, the controller manager, and the fourth one, the etcd. So those are the 4 elements that make actually the control plane of a Kubernetes cluster. I hope you like the video. See you guys on the next one.